The British Empire spanned continents, ruled over a quarter of the world's population, and shaped the course of global history for centuries, a colossal force of trade, conquest, culture, and conflict. But how did this small nation build the largest empire in history? And what led to its dramatic fall, reshaping the modern world forever? Today, we journey through the epic story of the rise and fall of the British Empire. The story of the British Empire begins in the late 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. England was a relatively small island nation, overshadowed by the mighty Spanish and Portuguese empires, who dominated the Americas and Asia. Yet, driven by a hunger for wealth, new trade routes, and rivalry with these powers, England began to look outward. Early attempts at colonization were tentative and often fraught with failure. The mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colony in 1585 is a haunting reminder of these early struggles. But in 1607, the establishment of Jamestown in Virginia marked the first successful English foothold in the New World. Meanwhile, the founding of the East India Company in 1600 signalled England's ambitions of trade and territorial expansion in India and beyond. The first voyage was under the command of James Lancaster, and there, early ventures were not centrally planned imperial projects, but rather opportunistic enterprises driven by private companies and adventurers. The Crown provided some oversight, but much of the empire's initial growth was piecemeal and experimental. By the 17th and 18th centuries, England had established colonies across North America, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, and Asia. The capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655 and the acquisition of the Cape of Good Hope in 1806 were strategic moves that expanded British influence and control over vital trade routes. At the heart of the British Empire's rise was its economic system. Early on, mercantilism dominated British policy. Colonies were seen as sources of raw materials, tobacco, sugar, cotton, spices, and as captive markets for British manufactured goods. Laws like the Navigation Acts ensured that colonial trade benefited the mother country, restricting commerce to British ships and ports. One of the darkest yet economically significant aspects of this system was the transatlantic slave trade. British ships transported over 3 million Africans to the Americas, fueling plantation economies in the Caribbean and the southern United States. The profits from slavery and slave-produced goods like sugar and cotton helped finance Britain's Industrial Revolution, banking and insurance sectors. The East India Company became a powerhouse, trading in textiles, tea, spices and opium, and eventually ruling large parts of India. The conquest of Bengal in the mid-18th century brought immense wealth and resources under British control, further fueling imperial ambitions. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. The empire provided both the raw materials needed for industry and vast markets for British goods. By the late 19th century, Britain was the world's leading trading nation and financial centre, with London at the heart of global finance. The British Empire's peak is generally identified between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, roughly from the 1870s to the 1910s. At this time, Britain controlled about a quarter of the world's land area and approximately 458 million people. This era, often called the Pax Britannica, was marked by relative peace enforced by British naval supremacy. The Royal Navy was the largest and most advanced in the world, controlling sea lanes and protecting trade routes vital to the empire's survival. Key territories included India, the jewel in the crown, providing vast resources and manpower. Canada, Australia and New Zealand, settler colonies rich in resources and strategic naval bases. Africa, where the scramble for Africa saw Britain acquire vast territories like Nigeria, Kenya and South Africa. The Caribbean, central to sugar production and the legacy of slavery. Strategic outposts like Egypt and the Suez Canal, which provided a vital shortcut to India and Asia. Trade hubs such as Hong Kong and Singapore, crucial for commerce in East Asia. Culturally, British institutions, language and legal systems spread across the globe, leaving a lasting imprint. English became a global lingua franca, and British sports, education and governance models took root in many colonies. Despite its grandeur, the British Empire was not without profound contradictions and costs. Colonial rule often involved conquest, displacement, and oppression of indigenous peoples. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and the violent partition of India are stark reminders of the human cost. And while Britain prospered, many colonies suffered economic underdevelopment, dependency, and resource extraction that benefited the empire more than local populations. Indigenous languages, religions, and customs were frequently marginalized or suppressed in favor of British norms, and colonial policies often entrenched ethnic and religious divisions, sowing seeds of future conflicts. Even within Britain, the empire shaped society, bringing new foods like tea and curry, but also fostering racial attitudes and imperial ideologies that justified domination. The 20th century brought challenges that the British Empire could not withstand indefinitely. The two world wars drained Britain's resources and weakened its economy. The rise of new powers like the United States, Germany, and Japan challenged British dominance. Maintaining vast overseas territories became increasingly costly and untenable. And across Asia, Africa and the Middle East, nationalist movements gained momentum. Charismatic leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India championed self-determination through nonviolent resistance, while others resorted to armed struggle. The horrors of war and the spread of democratic ideals made imperial rule increasingly indefensible. International bodies like the United Nations provided platforms for colonized peoples to demand independence. Public opinion within Britain shifted, questioning the morality and practicality of empire. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized Britain's diminished global status when it was forced to withdraw from Egypt under pressure from the two new major superpowers, the US and USSR. The process of decolonization was a complex, uneven process that unfolded over decades. India's independence in 1947 was a watershed moment, accompanied by the traumatic partition into India and Pakistan. Africa saw a wave of independence in the 1950s and 1960s, with countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda gaining sovereignty. The Caribbean and Southeast Asia followed with peaceful transitions in places like Jamaica, Malaysia, and Singapore. Some territories remain non-autonomous or disputed, reflecting the unfinished nature of decolonization. Britain transitioned from an empire to a commonwealth of nations, maintaining voluntary ties with former colonies. So, what is the legacy of the British Empire? It's important to recognise both the empire's contributions and its profound costs. There were positive aspects such as the spread of legal and political institutions, such as the rule of law and parliamentary democracy, the English language and educational systems that facilitated global communication and development, infrastructure investments like railways and ports that, while designed for imperial benefit, sometimes aided post-colonial growth, and for the British population who saw their country become one of the most wealthy in global history. However, much of this was owed to economic exploitation and underdevelopment in many former colonies. There were social divisions and ongoing conflicts rooted in colonial borders and policies, and of course the enduring scars of slavery, racial discrimination and violence. Many modern conflicts trace their roots to colonial era borders, drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural realities. The wealth generated by the empire is still visible in the grand architecture of British cities like London, Liverpool, Bristol and more. The British Empire's rise from scattered colonies to global superpower reshaped the world in profound ways. It fostered economic growth, cultural exchange, and political innovation, but also inflicted suffering, exploitation, and division. Its fall was as dramatic as its rise, driven by economic realities, nationalist aspirations, and changing global dynamics. The legacy of the British Empire continues to influence international relations, culture, and identity today. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you might like the channel to cover next. And let's be historied together.